The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Newport on March 15, 1889, as a maid approached room 237 of the exclusive Belmont Hotel. The silence behind the door was heavier than usual, a palpable void where life should have been. With a master key and a growing sense of dread, she turned the lock, the click echoing in the hushed hallway. Inside, time seemed to have stopped. The silk curtains were still drawn against the dawn, casting the lavish suite in a perpetual twilight. 2 champagne glasses sat untouched on the marble table, the bubbles long dead, a silent testament to a private gathering that had ended in mystery. The air was cold, carrying only the faint, fading scent of French perfume. On an ornate escritoire, a single page lay abandoned, a half-written letter bearing no signature. The pen had been dropped mid-sentence, as if the writer had been suddenly called away, or taken. The room was in perfect order, yet it felt like a crime scene. Isabella Fairmont, the woman who commanded presidents and princes, had vanished into the March fog without a trace. This discovery would ignite a 40-year mystery, a puzzle so dangerous it threatened to burn the very foundations of American high society. But to understand the shock of her disappearance, we must first understand the woman who became its central figure, and the glittering world she ruled with an iron will. Isabella Catherine Aldrich was born in 1859 into a rarefied stratum of American life. Her father, Cornelius Aldrich, was a shipping magnate who built an empire moving goods along the eastern seaboard, a titan of new industrial wealth. Her mother, however, provided the priceless currency of old blood, claiming direct descent from one of the original Massachusetts Bay Colony families. This combination of old money pedigree and new money power made Isabella the ultimate social prize. She possessed a striking, unforgettable beauty, raven black hair, piercing blue eyes, and a figure that inspired Parisian couturiers. But her true power lay in her understanding of the social machinery, a game she learned to play better than anyone. In 1878, her strategic marriage to Theodore Fairmont was the event of the decade. Theodore, heir to a colossal Pennsylvania steel fortune, offered serious stability to match Isabella's dazzling vivacity. Together, they were a Gilded Age power couple, their union cementing a financial and social empire that seemed unshakable. Their summer cottage, Rosecliff Manor, was a monument to this union. With 70 rooms, Italian marble imported at staggering cost, and gardens requiring 20 staff, it was a palace by the sea. Here, Isabella didn't just host parties, she orchestrated the very heartbeat of elite American society, creating a world where her favor was the only currency that truly mattered. Her summer parties became the stuff of legend, elaborate symphonies of power and privilege. Senators brushed shoulders with European dukes. Railroad tycoons struck million-dollar deals over glasses of vintage champagne. An invitation to Rosecliff wasn't just a social event, it was an anointing, a guarantee of one's place in the exclusive firmament for life. The press was her devoted chronicler. The Newport Daily News ran a weekly column titled Mrs. Fairmont's Week, documenting her charities, her fashion, and her illustrious guest lists. She funded Newport's first proper theater and personally selected European musicians for her soirees. Her influence was vast, touching business, politics, and culture. Even the President of the United States, Chester Arthur, dined at her table in the summer of 1883. Railroad executives sought her counsel, and politicians quietly vied for her endorsement. Isabella Fairmont wasn't just a socialite, she was the unofficial queen of a new American aristocracy, and her court was the most powerful in the nation. But such a throne is always precarious, built on a foundation of perception and perpetual performance. The same society columns that sang her praises were waiting, pens sharpened, for the first note of discord. The glittering world she commanded was a gilded cage, its bars made of gossip, rumor, and the ever-present threat of scandal. In this hermetically sealed universe of manufactured propriety, reputation was everything. It was a currency more valuable than steel or shipping shares, and it could be devalued overnight. The machinery that had lifted Isabella to such dazzling heights was perfectly designed to crush those who fell from its grace. For Isabella, that fall would not come from a business failure or a financial misstep. It would begin with a glance across a crowded room, with the arrival of a man who represented everything her world was not. The Golden Queen was about to meet a man of shadows, and their collision would shatter the perfect mirror of her life. The first crack in the facade appeared not with a bang, but a whisper during the summer of 1884. It started innocently, as these things often do. Isabella was seen dining alone with Jonathan Pembroke, a young architect hired to design additions for the mansions on Bellevue Avenue. He was an outsider, and that alone was enough to pique Newport's interest. Pembroke was barely 30, possessing a romantic intensity that stood in stark contrast to the staid bankers and industrialists who populated Newport's ballrooms. He arrived with impeccable professional credentials and a mysterious past that only added to his dangerous allure. He was a question mark in a world of tedious, well-known answers. His previous work, a Gothic revival mansion for a Pittsburgh steel baron, the restoration of a colonial Virginia estate, spoke of talent and vision. But it was his personal magnetism that truly set the gossip mills turning. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and intense green eyes that seemed to see through the elaborate pretenses of the wealthy. Jonathan Pembroke brought something to Newport it desperately lacked in its parade of suitable gentlemen, a whiff of genuine danger. And for a woman who had mastered every predictable aspect of her world, that danger would prove to be an irresistible, and ultimately fatal, lure. Their first meeting was electric, witnessed by others in a committee room planning the expansion of Trinity Church. Isabella was reviewing blueprints when Pembroke entered, and those present later spoke of the charged silence that fell, the undeniable current that passed between them as their eyes met across the mahogany table. A professional consultation was about to become a personal revolution. What began with discussions of architecture and design quickly evolved into something far more intimate and perilous. Pembroke began visiting Rosecliff Manor under the thin pretext of renovation plans, but he and Isabella would disappear for hours into her private study or wander the manicured gardens, lost in conversation that excluded the rest of the world. The mansion staff, trained in absolute discretion, began to notice the subtle shifts. The unique cadence of Isabella's laughter when Pembroke was near, the increasing frequency of his unheralded visits, the letters in a distinctive hand that arrived for her alone. A new energy hummed through the house, a secret current that everyone felt but no one dared name. Theo Fairmont, deeply engrossed in managing his steel empire and utterly trusting of his wife's impeccable social judgment, noticed nothing. He approved of Pembroke's work, even complimenting Isabella on her excellent choice of architect. This blindness, this absolute faith, would later become the source of his deepest torment and regret. But in the golden haze of that 1884 summer, Theodore saw only what he had always seen, his beautiful, capable wife managing their world with her legendary grace. He had no idea that the foundation of their carefully constructed life was already splitting apart, undermined by a passion he never anticipated and a betrayal he could not yet imagine. Newport society, however, operated with the efficiency of a spy network. By August, the whispers about Isabella and the architect had become murmured suspicions. By September, those murmurs had crystallized into a cold, certain belief among the elite: Isabella Fairmont was having an affair. The evidence was circumstantial, but in the court of social opinion, it was a damning indictment. She was observed entering Pembroke's temporary studio on Thames Street, a place no lady of her standing should visit alone. They were seen at the casino with their heads bent intimately together, sharing conversations that excluded all others. The most damaging account came from a maid employed by the formidable Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt, who claimed to have witnessed a passionate embrace in a conservatory. The very machinery that had proclaimed Isabella its queen now began to turn against her with silent, mechanical precision. Invitations to the most exclusive events began to thin. Conversations with former friends grew noticeably cooler, their warmth replaced by a polite, probing chill. The social universe was quietly realigning itself, pushing her from its center. Isabella, lost in what friends later described as a state of romantic intoxication, seemed almost blind to the gathering storm. She continued to see Pembroke with a boldness that bordered on defiance, as if challenging the gossips to do their worst. This reckless courage, however, only sealed her fate, accelerating her fall from a grace that was proving to be terrifyingly conditional. The scandal broke publicly with devastating force on October 12, 1884, in the morning edition of the New York Herald. A columnist known only as The Observer published a detailed, vicious account under the headline, "Newport's Fallen Angel." The article laid out the timeline of the affair with malicious precision, suggesting the writer had inside sources. But the article contained a revelation that shocked even Newport's jaded elite. Jonathan Pembroke, it claimed, was no mere architect dallying with a bored socialite. He was a man with substantial gambling debts and a documented history of attaching himself to wealthy women in Pittsburgh and Richmond, disappearing each time after acquiring significant funds. The column alleged Isabella had been funding his lifestyle, transferring large sums from her personal accounts. It even suggested several valuable pieces from the Fairmont art collection had been quietly sold at a loss to cover Pembroke's obligations. The narrative shifted from a tawdry affair to a potential swindle, and the damage became catastrophic. For Theodore Fairmont, reading this in his morning paper was a physical assault. His wife's infidelity was a deep private wound, but this public humiliation suggested she had also been made a fool, manipulated and robbed by a professional fortune hunter. The knowledge that his peers, his staff, and all of society had been watching this unfold while he remained ignorant compounded the agony. The confrontation that night in the Rosecliff Manor library was volcanic. According to Theodore's later statements, Isabella initially denied everything. But when confronted with bank records showing the transfers, $50,000 over 4 months, a sum worth over $1 million today, she broke down. She admitted the relationship but insisted her love for Pembroke was real, the money given freely. Theodore, heartbroken and enraged, issued an ultimatum: end all contact with Pembroke immediately, retire to Boston for a season of quiet rehabilitation, and submit to strict limits on her freedom and finances. In return, he would not seek a divorce and would work to rebuild their reputation. It was a harsh but predictable path for scandal management. Isabella's response was neither predictable nor submissive. She refused utterly. She declared her love for Pembroke, called her marriage a mistake, and stated her intention to seek a divorce, a social nuclear option that would have annihilated both their standings permanently. The argument raged behind closed doors until midnight, ending with the slam of a door and her footsteps fleeing up the marble stairs. Theodore emerged the next morning a hollowed-out man, aged a decade in a single night. But the financial audit he ordered revealed an even darker picture. The money transfers were just the beginning. Valued family jewelry, including his mother's diamond necklace, had been sold for a fraction of its worth. The evidence pointed not just to passion, but to deception. The final, crushing blow came from his private investigators. In Pittsburgh and Richmond, they found Pembroke's trail, similar relationships with wealthy, vulnerable women, large sums of money acquired, and a sudden disappearance when discovery loomed. Their report painted Pembroke not as a romantic, but as a sophisticated predator. A con man who targeted his victims with surgical precision. When Theodore presented this evidence to Isabella, expecting shock and remorse, he received neither. Instead, she defended Pembroke fiercely, insisting his past was misunderstood and their love was different. This defiant loyalty in the face of proof convinced Theodore she was beyond reason, trapped in a fantasy so complete she could no longer see the man who had ensnared her. By November 1884, Isabella's position was untenable. The scandal was national news, a delicious tale of a goddess's fall. Theodore's final offer was a gilded prison, public renunciation of Pembroke, a year of social exile, and severe restrictions. In return, he offered the cold comfort of preserving her title and their public facade. It was a deal that would save everything except her soul. Isabella's response was to vanish for 3 days. She was found under an assumed name in a Providence boarding house. But she was not broken. When confronted, she made a counterproposal that changed everything. She threatened not to flee, but to fight. And the weapon she chose was the truth, a truth so explosive it could reduce Newport's gilded mansions to ash. But beneath the glittering surface of Isabella's carefully orchestrated life, darker currents were already beginning to flow. The first whispers that would topple a queen began not as shouts, but as the softest of murmurs. They slipped through the ballrooms and across the manicured lawns of Newport in the summer of 1884, a season later remembered as the beginning of the end. It started with a name, spoken with a curious blend of admiration and suspicion: Jonathan Pembroke. He arrived in Newport with the precision of a planned invasion, a man seemingly crafted from the pages of a romantic novel. Barely 30, Pembroke possessed the dark, brooding looks and intense green eyes that stood in stark contrast to the stout, red-faced industrialists who dominated the scene. He was an artist, not a titan of industry, and that alone made him fascinating. His professional credentials were impeccable. He had designed a Gothic revival masterpiece for a Pittsburgh steel baron and restored a colonial estate in Virginia with scholarly care. But it was the mystery that clung to him, the unspoken chapters of his past, that truly set Newport's delicate social mechanism on edge. In a world where everyone's lineage was public record, Pembroke's silence was a provocation. His architectural talent was undeniable, but his true impact was more elemental. He carried an aura of genuine danger, a sense of real emotion in a society built on polished restraint. For the women of Newport, he was a thrilling distraction. For their husbands, he was an unsettling variable. And for Isabella Fairmont, he would become an obsession. Their first meeting was not at a glittering party, but in the sober confines of a committee meeting for the expansion of Trinity Church. Isabella, as always, was at the center of proceedings, reviewing plans with a practiced eye. When Jonathan Pembroke entered the room, witnesses would later describe a sudden, electric change in the atmosphere. The mundane discussion of beams and arches fell away as their eyes met across the mahogany table. It was a moment of profound recognition, a silent communication that bypassed all social formalities. In that instant, the carefully scripted story of Isabella's life was hijacked by a force she could neither control nor deny. A professional consultation had just become the prologue to a personal revolution. What began as discussions of columns and cornices quickly evolved into something far more intimate. Pembroke began visiting Rosecliff Manor under the thin pretext of consulting on renovation plans. But these were not business calls. He and Isabella would disappear for hours into her private study, its door firmly closed, or walk the labyrinthine paths of her garden, lost in conversations that lasted long past what was proper. The mansion staff, the silent witnesses to everything, began to notice the subtle but unmistakable signs. There was a new lightness in Isabella's step on the days Pembroke was expected. Her laughter, when he was near, had a different, freer melody. The household ledger showed unexplained expenses for late-night carriage hires and private dining deliveries for two. Letters began to arrive in a distinctive, bold handwriting, and Isabella would retrieve them herself from the silver salver in the hall, a rare break from protocol. The air inside Rosecliff seemed charged with a secret energy, a current that hummed just beneath the surface of normalcy. Everyone felt it, but in a house ruled by discretion, no one dared speak of it aloud. Theodore Fairmont, immersed in the complex negotiations of his steel empire, remained blissfully unaware. He saw Pembroke only as a talented artisan his wife had cleverly engaged. He even praised Isabella for her excellent taste and shrewd management of the estate's aesthetics. This trust, this absolute faith in her social genius, would later become the source of his most profound agony. He saw his beautiful wife presiding over dinners with her customary brilliance, discussing charity galas and guest lists. He had no inkling that her mind was elsewhere, replaying whispered conversations or anticipating the next clandestine meeting. The foundation of their world was cracking, but Theodore, looking at the pristine surface, saw only the reflection of his own contentment. Newport society, however, was a living organism with thousands of eyes and ears. Its survival depended on knowing everything about everyone. By late August, the whispered suspicions about Isabella and the architect had coalesced into a solid, shared certainty. The evidence was circumstantial, but in the court of social opinion, it was more than enough for a conviction. She was seen alone, entering Pembroke's rented studio on Thames Street, a place no lady of her standing should ever be. At the casino, they were observed in a secluded corner, their heads bent so close they nearly touched, speaking in tones meant for no one else. The most damning account came from a maid in the employ of Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt herself. This maid claimed to have witnessed, while fetching a shawl, a passionate embrace between Isabella and Pembroke in the Vanderbilt Conservatory during a private dinner. The story spread with viral speed, polished and embellished with each telling. The narrative was set, the queen had fallen, and her crown was teetering. The social machinery that had elevated Isabella now began its ruthless work in reverse. Invitations to the most exclusive events, once guaranteed, now required regretful consultations of her schedule. Conversations with former friends grew shorter, their warmth replaced by a cool, assessing politeness. The intricate dance of the season subtly reorganized itself, leaving Isabella increasingly on the periphery. Isabella, however, seemed almost intoxicated by the danger. Friends recalled her being in a state of radiant recklessness, as if the disapproval of society only fueled her defiance. She began to see Pembroke with less caution, her carriage seen outside his studio in the afternoon, their public appearances together carrying a new boldness. She was not hiding, she was daring them all to watch. This public flaunting of convention was a catastrophic miscalculation. In Newport, discreet affairs could be tolerated, even tacitly expected. But a public romance that challenged the sanctity of marriage and mocked social norms was an existential threat. Isabella wasn't just breaking a rule, she was threatening the rulebook itself, and the guardians of that book began to mobilize. The scandal broke with the force of a summer storm on the morning of October 12, 1884. The weapon was the New York Herald, and the assassin was a society columnist who wrote under the pen name Observer. The headline was a masterpiece of destruction, Newport's Fallen Angel, the sordid tale of Mrs. Theodore Fairmont and her architect. The article was not a gossip item, it was a forensic dissection. It laid out the timeline of the affair with devastating specificity, naming dates, locations, and amounts of money, suggesting the writer had sources inside the Fairmont household or banking circles. It painted Isabella not as a tragic romantic, but as a foolish, infatuated woman being bled dry. But the true bombshell was its characterization of Jonathan Pembroke. He was not portrayed as a star-crossed lover. According to the Herald, he was a man with crippling gambling debts, a professional fortune hunter with a documented history in Pittsburgh and Richmond. In each city, he had attached himself to a wealthy, vulnerable woman, acquired large sums, and vanished when discovery loomed. The article alleged Isabella had transferred vast sums from her personal accounts to cover his obligations. It hinted that family heirlooms, jewelry, art, had been quietly liquidated at a loss. The story transformed from a tale of infidelity to one of predation and humiliation. Isabella was no longer just unfaithful, she was a victim being paraded in front of the entire nation. For Theodore Fairmont, reading this at the breakfast table was an experience of physical violence. The private wound of betrayal was now a public spectacle. The article implied he was not just a cuckold, but a fool, the last man in America to know his wife was being systematically swindled. The humiliation was absolute, and it was printed in black ink for millions to see. His rage was cold and methodical. Before confronting Isabella, he ordered a full audit of their personal finances and dispatched private investigators to Pittsburgh and Richmond. He needed facts, not emotions. That evening, he entered the library at Rosecliff Manor not as a heartbroken husband, but as a prosecutor preparing his case. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything. The confrontation in the library was less an argument than a trial. According to Theodore's later, spare testimony, Isabella initially met his accusations with frosty denial. She called the article vile gossip, the invention of jealous rivals. Her poise was magnificent, the performance of a lifetime. But Theodore did not come to argue, he came with evidence. He placed the bank ledgers on the desk between them, pages marked showing transfer after transfer to an account under Pembroke's control. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. Seeing the irrefutable numbers, Isabella's defiance crumbled. She broke down, admitting the relationship but pleading its authenticity. She insisted the money was given out of love, not manipulation. Theodore, his voice shaking with a mixture of heartbreak and fury, issued his ultimatum. All contact with Pembroke must end immediately. She would retire to their Boston home for an indefinite period, a social exile. Her personal finances would be controlled, her movements monitored. In exchange, he would not seek a divorce and would begin the long, arduous work of rehabilitating their public image. Isabella's response was not contrition. It was a declaration of war. She looked at her husband, not with guilt, but with a terrifying clarity. She told him she loved Jonathan Pembroke. She called their marriage a beautiful cage, a mistake of convenience. And then she said the unspeakable, she would seek a divorce. In 1884, for a woman of her standing, it was social suicide, a scandal from which there could be no return. The argument that followed raged through the grand house, heard by servants frozen in their tracks. It was a torrent of accusations, pleadings, and shattered illusions. It ended near midnight with the sound of a door slamming with such force it rattled the portraits in the hall, followed by the frantic, fleeing rhythm of Isabella's footsteps on the marble staircase. Theodore emerged the next morning a ghost of himself, his face hollow, his eyes aged by a decade in a single night. But his pain quickly hardened into a resolve for the full truth. The financial audit he had ordered returned with even more disturbing revelations. The money transfers were just the beginning. Several pieces of significant jewelry, including a diamond necklace that was a Fairmont family heirloom, had been sold. The sale prices were a fraction of their appraised value, suggesting rushed, secretive transactions. The investigators' report painted a picture not of a woman in love, but of a woman being systematically drained of her assets. The final, definitive blow arrived from his agents in Pittsburgh. Their findings were chillingly consistent. Jonathan Pembroke had been involved with the wife of a prominent industrialist there. The pattern was identical: intense romance, financial gifts, and a sudden, silent departure when the husband began asking questions. The Richmond file told the same story with a different widow and a different fortune. The evidence was incontrovertible. Pembroke was a predator. When Theodore presented this dossier to Isabella, he expected the scales to fall from her eyes. He anticipated horror, remorse, the shocking return to reality. What he received was something far more frightening: unwavering faith. Isabella defended Pembroke with a fervor that bordered on fanaticism. She insisted his past was misunderstood, that those women had lied, that their love was different and pure. Her loyalty in the face of irrefutable proof was absolute. Theodore realized then that he had not just lost his wife to another man, he had lost her to a fantasy, a fabrication so complete it had replaced her reality. By November 1884, Isabella Fairmont stood utterly alone. The scandal was a national fever dream, the subject of sermons and newspaper cartoons. Theodore's final offer was a lifeline of pure pragmatism, a stark, humiliating path back to a gilded prison. Public renunciation, total exile, financial control. In return, she could keep her name and the empty shell of her position. Isabella listened to this proposal in the drawing room of Rosecliff, a room that had once echoed with the laughter of her triumphs. She looked at the man who was her husband, a stranger now. She looked at the walls of her beautiful cage. And she said nothing. She simply stood, walked out of the room, and out of the house. Isabella's response was to disappear for 3 days. Isabella Fairmont did not flee Newport in shame. She returned to it with a weapon. After 3 days missing, she was discovered not cowering, but waiting, under an assumed name at a modest Providence boarding house. When Theodore and his lawyers confronted her, they expected surrender or hysterics. What they received was a counterproposal that turned the tables entirely. Isabella was calm, her eyes clear of the romantic intoxication that had blinded her. She spoke not of love, but of leverage. Her affair with Jonathan Pembroke, she explained, had given her more than just scandal. It had given her secrets. As an architect, Pembroke had been hired to make sensitive modifications to several Newport mansions, and in his intimate confidence, he had revealed everything. She claimed to know about hidden rooms constructed behind libraries, secret passages woven into the walls of ballrooms, and concealed safes built into the foundations of summer cottages. These were not whimsical additions, she stated. They were purpose-built to hide evidence, proof of bribery, land fraud, tax evasion, and illegal contracts that could topple empires. Theodore's lawyers were skeptical, but a cold dread began to seep into the room. Isabella's allegations were not vague rumors. They were specific, named names, and described architectural details with shocking precision. She claimed to have documentation proving Senator William Blackstone hid bribery ledgers in a compartment behind his library fireplace. She alleged railroad magnate Charles Peabody stored forged land titles in a secret room beneath his wine cellar. Most explosively, she insisted she had evidence linking 3 families to a conspiracy to rig government steel prices. This was no longer about a socialite's affair. This was about the criminal foundations of Gilded Age wealth. The threat was catastrophic. Even if her claims were only partially true, the scandal of the investigation itself would be ruinous. In this world, the mere accusation of criminality could collapse credit, dissolve partnerships, and end political careers. Isabella was no longer asking for forgiveness. She was negotiating a surrender, and she held a gun to the head of Newport itself. A clandestine meeting was arranged for November 20, 1884, in the private dining room of the very hotel where her story would later begin, the Belmont. The attendees were not social friends, but representatives of power, lawyers and trusted agents for the Blackstone, Peabody, Vanderbilt, and 2 other supremely powerful families. The air was thick with tension and the scent of expensive cigars. Isabella arrived alone, dressed with severe elegance. She presented her terms not as pleas, but as demands. $100,000 in cash, delivered to her directly. Jonathan Pembroke's considerable gambling debts were to be quietly, permanently settled. And guaranteed, anonymous safe passage for both of them to Europe, where they would remain in permanent exile. In exchange, she would vanish from American society forever. She would take her knowledge, and more importantly, her documentation, with her. The families would be spared not just scandal, but prison. It was a simple, brutal transaction, their freedom for hers. The silence that followed her proposal was heavier than any outburst. The negotiation lasted 6 grueling hours, stretching past midnight. Counteroffers were made, threats were veiled in legal language. The families agreed to the money and the debt settlement, but they imposed brutal conditions of their own. Isabella and Pembroke would travel separately, on different ships. They would have no contact for a minimum of 2 years. Most critically, both would sign legally binding affidavits swearing never to return to the United States or communicate with anyone in Newport society again. They were not being bought off, they were being erased. Isabella listened to these amended terms, her face a mask of cool composure. Witnesses, however, noted something unsettling in her demeanor. She seemed distant, almost dreamy, as if part of her was already elsewhere. When pressed if she understood the permanence of this exile, the total severing of her life, she offered a faint, enigmatic smile. "Some sacrifices," she said quietly, "are worth making for love." Her agreement felt less like a victory and more like a trance. The machinery of the agreement clicked into motion with efficient, silent speed. The enormous sum was assembled and deposited in a New York bank account under the name I.C. Aldrich, her maiden initials. Pembroke's creditors were mysteriously paid in full. Passage was booked. Pembroke would sail first on the Aurora, and Isabella would follow days later on the steamship Britannica. Everything was arranged for the most expensive, most discreet love story in Gilded Age history. But as the players moved into position, a different script was being written in the shadows. The families had agreed to terms, but trust was a currency none of them possessed. The danger Isabella represented could not be sailed away, it could only be extinguished. Isabella returned to Newport for her final week, checking into a suite at the Belmont Hotel under her maiden name, Aldridge. The symbolism was deliberate. She was shedding the identity of Mrs. Theodore Fairmont, of the scandal, of the doomed queen. She was becoming someone new, or perhaps returning to someone old. The hotel staff found her remarkably composed. She took her meals in solitude in her room, received no visitors, and spent long hours writing at the escritoire. The young desk clerk, William Chen, noted she mailed a significant number of letters, their destinations unknown. She moved through the hotel with a serene purpose, a woman who had made her peace and was simply waiting for her new life to begin. On November 28, she made an unusual request. She hired a photographer, Marcus Steinberg, to come to the hotel and take a formal portrait. Steinberg, accustomed to society ladies wanting flattering images, found the session deeply strange. Isabella posed with intense focus for nearly 2 hours, demanding specific lighting, specific angles, as if seeking to capture not just her likeness, but her essence. She paid in cash and waited in his studio while the glass plate negatives were developed, refusing to leave without them. Steinberg later recalled the haunting look in her eyes, a profound sadness layered over a steel-like determination. She fidgeted with a ruby brooch at her throat. When he suggested a future session in Europe, she simply smiled. "That won't be necessary," she said. The developed photographs, discovered decades later, are a chilling relic. They show Isabella in formal black silk, her beauty stark and severe. Her expression is calm, but her eyes hold a faraway look, as if gazing at a horizon only she could see. In several frames, she seems to be looking just past the camera, at a presence outside the frame. They are not pictures of a beginning, but of an ending. The next day, December 1st, Isabella embarked on a solitary pilgrimage. She hired a carriage and driver, Thomas McGillicuddy, for the entire day. Her instructions were specific, a tour of Newport's landmarks. They went to the casino, where she had once held court. They stopped at Trinity Church, where she had been married. They rode along the cliff walk, where she had walked with presidents. At each location, she did not merely look. She descended from the carriage and stood in silent communion, her eyes tracing the lines of the buildings, the paths of the gardens, the sweep of the ocean view. McGillicuddy later told police it felt less like a tour and more like a farewell, as if she was memorizing the landscape of her former life before setting it permanently adrift. As dusk gathered, she returned to the Belmont Hotel. The night manager, Robert Sterling, personally brought a late supper to her room. He found her changed into an elegant evening gown of deep blue silk, the ruby brooch glittering at her neck. She seemed both agitated and resolutely calm, a storm contained within glass. She thanked Sterling for his service during her stay and pressed into his hand a tip so extravagantly large it embarrassed him. When he tried to protest, she gently closed his fingers around the money. "Generosity," she said softly, "is one of the few true privileges wealth provides. I wish to exercise it while I still can." Her words hung in the air, heavy with finality. At approximately 11:30 that night, the night clerk William Chen saw her descend the grand staircase. She was dressed for travel in a dark coat, a hat veiled with netting, and carried a single leather valise. She moved with purpose but without haste, a woman in control of her departure. Chen, ever dutiful, asked if she required a carriage. She declined with a polite shake of her head. "My arrangements are already made," she said, her voice clear and firm. She crossed the lobby, a solitary figure in the vast, quiet space, and pushed open the heavy oak door to the portico. Chen watched from the window as she descended the steps and turned onto the street. A thick, cold fog had rolled in from the harbor, a common blanket that swallowed sound and sight. Within 3 steps, the silhouette of her coat, the shape of her hat, blurred into the swirling gray-white mist. Within 5, she was completely gone, absorbed by the night and the weather. The street was empty. It was the last time anyone would see Isabella Fairmont alive. The alarm was raised the next morning, December 2nd, when Isabella failed to board the Britannica. Theodore Fairmont, fearing a last-minute change of heart or a public scene, had stayed away from the docks. When the ship sailed without her, a cold dread settled in his stomach. He contacted the Newport police, and the official machinery of inquiry began to turn, slowly and clumsily. Chief Detective Samuel Harrison was a methodical man, shaped by waterfront brawls and domestic disputes, not the silent mysteries of the elite. He entered room 237 at the Belmont Hotel and found a scene of eerie order. Clothing was neatly folded in trunks, personal effects arranged on the dresser. It felt less like a room hastily abandoned and more like a stage set after the actor had left. But the order itself was the first clue. Several pieces of valuable jewelry noted by the staff were missing. Her personal papers included drafts of heartfelt, final letters to family members, but the finished versions were gone. Most telling was the fireplace. Among the cold ashes, Harrison found fragments of a partially burned document. The charred pieces, carefully pieced together, showed financial calculations and initials, J.P. for Jonathan Pembroke, and W.B. William Blackstone. This was not the note of a lovesick woman eloping. It was the cold record of a negotiation, a piece of a puzzle Detective Harrison did not yet understand. The disappearance was beginning to smell less like a romance and more like a crime. Harrison's first move was to trace Jonathan Pembroke. The architect was supposed to be safely in London, the agreed-upon first act of the exile. A telegram to British authorities, however, returned a chilling response. No one matching Pembroke's description had arrived. The address provided was a mail drop, a ghost address. Jonathan Pembroke had vanished into thin air. A review of the steamship manifest for the Aurora delivered the next shock. A ticket had been purchased in Pembroke's name, but the passenger had never boarded. The architect's elegant escape to Europe was a fiction. He had never left American soil. This discovery shifted everything. If Pembroke hadn't fled, then where was he? And what did that mean for Isabella? The answer came not from Newport, but from Boston. Routine police bulletins revealed a John Doe fitting Pembroke's description had been found dead in a boarding house on November 30th, 2 days before Isabella's disappearance. The cause was listed as heart failure, a quiet end for a young man. But the boarding house keeper reported visitors, 2 well-dressed gentlemen who spent hours in Pembroke's room the day he died. Pembroke had not vanished. He had been silenced. And the timing was precise. His death ensured he could not meet Isabella, could not confirm the exile plan, could not warn her. She had walked into her final night believing her lover was waiting, when in truth, he was already in a cold storage drawer. This was not an elopement gone wrong, it was a trap being sprung. Detective Harrison now understood he was not looking for a missing socialite, but for a victim. The investigation gained a grim new urgency. He began re-interviewing everyone, looking for a crack in the official story. That crack appeared in the form of Mrs. Margaret Winthrop, an elderly seamstress with a reputation for gossip and keen eyesight. Mrs. Winthrop requested a private meeting, her hands trembling. She claimed that on the night of December 1st, while working late at the Peabody mansion, she heard voices in the rear courtyard. Peering from a sewing room window, she saw Isabella Fairmont speaking with 2 men. The conversation was heated, Isabella gesturing forcefully. After 20 minutes, one man handed her an envelope, and all 3 departed in a closed carriage. Her story was problematic. She was a known gossip, and her vantage point was poor. Harrison was skeptical until she provided one undeniable detail. She described the ruby brooch at Isabella's throat, how it caught the stray moonlight in a specific, glittering way. It was a detail known only to the hotel staff and the photographer. Mrs. Winthrop had seen something. This testimony gave Harrison a location and a scenario. Isabella had gone to the Peabody mansion, the home of railroad magnate Charles Peabody, one of the men she had threatened to expose. She had gone willingly, perhaps for a final payment or guarantee. And she had left with 2 unknown men. This was the last verifiable movement of Isabella Fairmont. While Harrison pursued witnesses, a parallel investigation was unfolding in the world of finance. A federal investigator, specializing in the new and complex crimes of wealth, examined the money trail of the exile agreement. The $100,000 had been transferred to the I.C. Aldrich account in New York as promised. But the account had never been accessed. The fortune meant to fund a new life sat frozen. More crucially, the handwriting on the bank forms to open that account did not match Isabella's. Someone else had opened it, using forged documents. The money had been placed, but it was never intended to be collected. It was a prop in a performance, a financial phantom meant to give the story of exile a paper trail. The realization was chilling, the entire agreement may have been a sham from the beginning. This financial sleuthing led to the most sinister player of all, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Harrison discovered that several of the Newport families had hired Pinkertons for discreet surveillance related to the Fairmont matter. Through legal pressure, he obtained heavily redacted files. The language within was bureaucratic but bloodless. Reports spoke of neutralizing the threat and ensuring permanent discretion. They documented Isabella's and Pembroke's every move in the weeks leading to their disappearance. A memo dated November 28 noted that the target's emotional state provides optimal cover for various outcomes. The Pinkertons weren't just watching, they were managing, and their suggested outcomes were final. Harrison now had a theory, but he needed physical proof. He returned to Isabella's original explosive allegation, the hidden chambers in the Newport mansions. Working with a city building inspector, he obtained the original architectural plans Jonathan Pembroke had filed for modifications to the Peabody mansion. The plans were masterpieces of deception. On the surface, they showed a simple expansion of the wine cellar. But careful measurement revealed a discrepancy. The plans indicated a foundation wall 8 feet thicker than the city's original blueprints allowed for. Pembroke hadn't just built a wine cellar, he had designed a secret room within it. According to Isabella, this was where Charles Peabody hid his forged land deeds. On February 14, 1890, a Valentine's Day none would forget, Detective Harrison arrived at the Peabody mansion with a search warrant, federal agents, and the building inspector. The mansion was empty, its owner conveniently in New York. The team moved directly to the basement, to the cold, stone-lined wine cellar. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and old wood. The north wall appeared utterly normal, lined with racks of dusty bottles. But the inspector's tape measure confirmed the discrepancy from the plans. There was a void behind the stone. With picks and crowbars, the investigators began to carefully break through the mortar. The sound of cracking stone echoed in the cavernous silence. After an hour of labor, a stone gave way, revealing not earth, but a black emptiness. They had found the false wall. Tearing it down revealed a hidden chamber, about 10 feet square, lined with a strange, dull metal sheeting. The building inspector touched it and identified it immediately: lead. The room was sheathed in lead, a material that muffled all sound, that would contain any cry. The beam of Harrison's lantern cut through the dusty gloom, piercing a darkness that had been sealed for over 2 months. It swept across the floor and caught on a shape in the far corner, a heap of fabric that seemed out of place. As the light settled, the fabric resolved into the once elegant folds of a silk evening cloak, now stained and darkened. Pinned to the collapsed fabric was a brooch, its stone capturing the lantern light with a dull, crimson glow. It was the ruby brooch. Wrapped within the cloak were the remains of Isabella Fairmont. The scene was not one of violent struggle, but of silent, cold entombment. She had been placed here, in this soundproof tomb, and left. The coroner's examination later that day would reveal the precise, clinical method of the murder. Isabella had been poisoned with chloral hydrate, a sedative mixed into champagne. Death would have been slow, a drifting into unconsciousness. But the scratch marks on the lead-lined walls told the final, horrifying chapter. She had awakened in the pitch black, disoriented and terrified. She had clawed at the seamless metal walls until her fingers were raw, trying to find a seam, a latch, a way out. The poison had slowly claimed her as she fought against her tomb. In her hand, they found a scrap of paper, a note she had tried to write in the dark, the pencil lines frantic and illegible. The discovery of Isabella's body transformed the investigation from a missing persons case into a murder inquiry of unprecedented complexity. The arrest of Charles Peabody, William Blackstone, and 3 other pillars of Newport sent seismic tremors through the nation. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed the gilded facade would be torn down entirely. The murder charges were explicit, the evidence in the lead-line chamber was grotesquely compelling, and public outrage was a tangible force. Justice, it appeared, was finally arriving for Isabella Fairmont. But the machinery of wealth and influence had merely been startled, not broken. Within weeks of the arrests, the case began to unravel with a sinister precision. Key witnesses developed sudden cases of amnesia. Mrs. Margaret Winthrop, the seamstress, recanted her entire testimony, claiming poor eyesight and an overactive imagination had misled her. Material evidence began to vanish from police custody. The ruby brooch disappeared from an evidence locker, only to reappear weeks later on the desk of a senior prosecutor with no paperwork to explain its return. The partial note from Isabella's hand was lost entirely. It was as if a giant, invisible hand was methodically erasing the facts from the blackboard. The most devastating blow came from an unexpected quarter, Theodore Fairmont himself. Through his lawyers, he issued a public statement. He expressed immense personal grief but declared he could not endure further scandal. He wished to let his wife rest in peace and would no longer cooperate with the prosecution. The foundation of the case crumbled with his withdrawal. Behind this sorrowful facade, a different transaction had occurred. Federal investigators later pieced together a quiet agreement. Theodore's steel company received preferential treatment on lucrative government contracts. His social standing was guaranteed. In exchange, he accepted the official, sanitized story: Isabella, despondent over her exile, had taken her own life in a tragic, private act. Without Theodore's support, and with witnesses and evidence dissolving, the legal proceedings collapsed. Charles Peabody was acquitted for lack of evidence. Senator Blackstone's case was dismissed on a procedural technicality. The implicated Pinkerton agents vanished, presumably provided with new identities and generous pensions for their discretion. The courtroom doors slammed shut, and the world moved on. Isabella was buried quietly in the Fairmont family plot in October 1890. No grand eulogies were spoken, no society columns mourned her passing. It was a funeral of silence, the final act in a cover-up that seemed perfect in its execution. The powerful families returned to their mansions, believing they had successfully buried their crime along with their victim. But a different kind of justice, slow and inexorable, was already in motion. The corruption Isabella had threatened to expose did not vanish with her, it festered. Charles Peabody, the man in whose basement Isabella died, became a prisoner in his own mind. He reported constant cold drafts in sealed rooms, the faint scent of French perfume, and the sound of scratching from behind his walls. He abandoned the Newport mansion, but found no peace. His business empire, built on the fraudulent railroad contracts Isabella knew about, began to implode. Federal investigators, on a different track, uncovered his scheme. By 1895, Peabody Steel was in ruins, and he died in 1897, a bankrupt recluse. The official cause was heart failure, but his empty bottle of chloral hydrate told another story. Senator William Blackstone's downfall was similarly poetic. In 1892, an unrelated corruption probe discovered the very bribery ledgers Isabella said were hidden behind his library fireplace. He was expelled from the Senate in disgrace, his name a byword for graft. He died in a rented room in 1899, his family fortune obliterated by legal fees and fines. The truth he killed to hide found him anyway. One by one, the conspirators met their reckoning. Railroad magnate Thomas Hartwell's price-fixing conspiracy was exposed by the Interstate Commerce Commission, leading to financial ruin and his suicide. Banking heir Robert Sterling's illegal lending practices collapsed his institution during the Panic of 1893. The fortunes that had purchased murder were consumed by the same greed that demanded it. The Pinkerton Detective Agency, the sharp tool of the elite, saw its reputation shattered. Congressional investigations into labor violence exposed their brutal, illegal methods. The agency's involvement in the Fairmont affair whispered through these hearings, destroying the trust of their remaining clients. By the turn of the century, the once feared agency was a hollow shell, a casualty of its own dark work. Detective Samuel Harrison, the man who found the body, carried the case with him for life. He retired from the Newport police in 1905, but never stopped investigating. In private files, he compiled notes linking other mysterious deaths and disappearances of the 1880s to the same web of power. He died in 1918, convinced Isabella's murder was part of a systemic campaign of silencing. His final report, discovered among his effects, concluded with a grim prophecy. They proved that wealth could place men above the law, he wrote. That precedent, once set, has never truly been undone. The ghost of Mrs. Fairmont does not haunt a mansion, it haunts our very system of justice. His words were filed away, unread by the powerful. The physical legacy of the crime took on a life of its own. The Peabody Mansion stood empty for decades, a decaying monument on Bellevue Avenue. Locals reported lights flickering in its windows, the sound of a woman's heels on the marble floors, and on foggy nights, the distinct scent of jasmine perfume. It was purchased by a charity and turned into an orphanage in 1920. The children, however, were terrified of it. They spoke of a sad lady who walked the halls at night. Staff heard scratching sounds from the basement, even after the wine cellar was bricked up. The orphanage closed in 1935, deemed unfit for the children's well-being. When the mansion was demolished in 1938, workers found smaller, unknown hidden chambers, containing personal effects that suggested other victims. The ruby brooch embarked on its own cursed journey. Returned to Theodore Fairmont, he donated it to a Boston museum to rid himself of it. It was stolen in 1895. It reappeared in 1902 among the jewels of a New York socialite who died by suicide. In 1918, it was found in the possession of a Philadelphia heiress who perished mysteriously in the flu pandemic. The jewel seemed to carry its own death sentence. Theodore Fairmont, forever marked by his compromise, never remarried. He lived a quiet, somber life in Boston, dedicating his later years and vast wealth to a cause he never named. Upon his death in 1923, his will established the Fairmont Foundation, a philanthropic organization with a secret mandate to investigate unsolved crimes against women, particularly those involving powerful men. The foundation operated discreetly for decades, funding inquiries and supporting legal challenges. It never solved a case as dramatic as Isabella's, but it brought quiet attention to patterns of violence the official systems ignored. It was Theodore's lifelong, unspoken penance, a shadow investigation funded by the fortune that had bought his silence. The greatest mystery endured. Where was Isabella's evidence? Detective Harrison had died believing she hid it. For 65 years, it remained lost, the final proof of her truth. Then, in 1954, during renovations at the Belmont Hotel, a workman's hammer struck a hollow sound behind a basement brick. Behind it was a rusted metal box, sealed with wax. Inside was a thick envelope, marked with the initials ICA and the date November 30, 1889. It contained everything: detailed financial records, copies of forged deeds, correspondence between the conspirators, and architectural plans for the hidden chambers with notes in Isabella's hand. She had hidden her insurance policy in the very hotel where she was last seen alive. The discovery was a historical thunderclap, but a quiet one. By 1954, all the principles were dust. The statute of limitations had expired. The Newport Historical Society accepted the documents, where they reside today in a quiet exhibit. Visitors reading her notes often report a sudden chill in the air, as if the writer is finally witnessing the long-delayed vindication. The Belmont Hotel retired the number 237, converting the room to storage. Yet staff still report anomalies: the scent of jasmine in a linen closet, the sound of a woman weeping near the old service stairs, the feeling of being watched by a sorrowful, persistent presence. The building itself seems to remember. Historian Dr. Margaret Steinberg published the definitive account of the case in 1979. Her book, The Newport Murders, wove together all the threads: Harrison's files, the 1954 discovery, the tragic fates of the families. Isabella Fairmont died, Steinberg wrote, because she understood that the wealth around her was a crime scene. Her murder was not a passion, but a corporate decision. In 2019, the FBI's Cold Case Unit announced a forensic review of the evidence, using modern DNA techniques. They acknowledged prosecution was impossible, but stated the review was a matter of historical justice. The announcement sparked a renewed fascination, a reminder that some stories refuse to stay buried, no matter how much earth is piled upon them. The true legacy of Isabella Fairmont is not a ghost story, but a cautionary tale about power. It reveals how easily justice can be purchased and silenced, but also how corruption contains the seeds of its own destruction. The conspirators won in the courtroom, but they lost in history, their names forever tied to a cowardly murder in a lead-lined room. Her courage, to stand against the most powerful forces in America, cost her everything. Yet her sacrifice ensured that the truth, like the evidence behind the brick, would one day be found. It stands as a warning that there is a price for challenging entrenched power, and a different, deeper price for surrendering to it. So what do you think? Was the full truth ever revealed, or do secrets still lie buried beneath Newport's manicured lawns? Could such a conspiracy happen today? The story of Isabella Fairmont reminds us that the past is never truly past, and that some echoes never fade. If you were chilled by this journey into the gilded shadows, remember to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We uncover the stories they tried to bury. Share this with someone who loves mysteries where the truth is darker than fiction. Let us know in the comments what you believe happened on Isabella's final night. The truth has a way of surfacing, even from behind lead-lined walls. See you in the next video.